Picture this. You're standing in the sweltering heat of ancient Carthage, watching in horror as screaming infants are hurled alive into the blazing furnace of a bronze statue shaped like a bull-headed god. The parents stand nearby, their faces painted with forced smiles, forbidden from showing grief, lest they anger Moloch and render their child's sacrifice worthless. The smell of burning flesh mingles with incense as priests chant prayers that sound more like the wailing of the damned. This isn't some fever dream or Hollywood horror movie. This was Tuesday afternoon in one of humanity's most civilized ancient empires. Quick challenge before we dive in. Drop a comment below telling us what country you're watching from and what time it is right now. Let's see how globally weird this journey gets. Welcome to a world where the line between sacred and savage was drawn in blood, where the gods demanded prices that would make modern serial killers blush, and where entire civilizations built their foundations on rituals so bizarre that archaeologists still argue about whether they actually happened. Today, we're peeling back the sanitized veneer of ancient history textbooks to reveal the twisted, terrifying, and occasionally hilarious truth about how our ancestors tried to make sense of their world through some of the most mind-bending ceremonies ever devised by human imagination. The ancient world wasn't just pyramids and philosophy. It was a carnival of the macabre, where death dances were literal, where gods ate people for breakfast, and where a bad harvest could mean your neighbor's heart was getting carved out on an altar by sunrise. These weren't the actions of primitive savages, mind you. These were sophisticated civilizations with complex mathematics, stunning architecture, and intricate legal systems. They could calculate the movement of celestial bodies and create art that still takes our breath away today. Yet somehow, they also thought the best way to ensure a good wheat crop was to bury a dozen people alive in a field. Let's start our journey in ancient Egypt, where death wasn't just an ending, it was a multi-billion-dollar industry with a customer service department that made Amazon look amateur. The Egyptians didn't just mummify pharaohs, they mummified everything. Cats, birds, crocodiles, and even individual body parts got the full preservation treatment. But here's where it gets weird. They also mummified food. Archaeologists have found perfectly preserved ancient Egyptian sandwiches, complete with pickles, wrapped in linen and treated with the same reverence as a dead king. Imagine explaining to your insurance company that your lunch qualifies as a religious artifact. The mummification process itself was a masterclass in organized chaos. First, the embalmers would stick a long bronze rod up the deceased's nose and scramble their brains like eggs, then pour the grey matter out through the nostrils. They'd make an incision in the abdomen and remove everything except the heart, because, apparently, the heart was needed for the afterlife, but the liver was just dead weight. The organs were stored in canopic jars, guarded by 4 different gods, each with their own specialty. Imsiti watched over the liver. Hopi took care of the lungs. Duamutef handled the stomach, and Kebesenuf was stuck with intestine duty. Talk about divine specialization. But the Egyptians took their death obsession to levels that would make a modern goth teenager jealous. They practiced a ritual called opening of the mouth, where priests would use special tools to symbolically restore the deceased's ability to eat, drink, and speak in the afterlife. This involved touching the mummy's face with instruments that looked suspiciously like ancient dental tools, while reciting spells that roughly translated to "wake up, you're immortal now." The ceremony could last for hours, with priests meticulously touching every part of the mummy's body while chanting instructions for navigating the afterlife. It was like the world's most expensive and elaborate GPS system for dead people. The Egyptians also believed in something called the negative confession, where the deceased had to stand before 42 judges in the afterlife and declare all the things they hadn't done wrong. This wasn't just "I didn't steal" or "I didn't murder anyone." Oh no, the list included gems like "I have not copulated with a boy," "I have not been sullen," and "I have not increased my wealth except through my own possessions." Imagine if modern job interviews required you to list every sin you hadn't committed. The ancient Egyptian afterlife was basically a cosmic HR department with a very thorough background check process. Speaking of thorough, let's talk about ancient Egyptian festivals, where the living and dead partied together in ways that would make modern Halloween celebrations look like a church picnic. During the Festival of Drunkenness, Egyptians would literally drink themselves into oblivion to honor the goddess Hathor, who once got so drunk that she forgot she was supposed to destroy humanity. The festival involved consuming massive quantities of beer while dancing with mummies. Yes, you read that right. They would bring their preserved ancestors out of storage and include them in the festivities. Nothing says family reunion like cracking open a cold one with great-great-grandfather's mummified corpse. But Egypt's weirdness was just the opening act. Let's sail up the Nile and over to Mesopotamia, where the ancient Sumerians invented writing, mathematics, and the wheel, and then used all three to keep detailed records of their absolutely unhinged religious ceremonies. The Sumerians believed that their gods were basically immortal teenagers with serious anger management issues and a taste for human sacrifice. To keep these divine brats happy, they developed a ritual called the sacred marriage, where the king would literally marry a goddess by having sex with her high priestess in front of the entire city. This wasn't some private ceremony in a temple. The back room, the sacred marriage, was a public spectacle, where thousands of people would gather to watch their ruler consummate his divine union. The priestess, who represented the goddess Inanna, would be dressed in elaborate costumes and jewelry worth more than most people's houses. The king would wear a crown that weighed more than a small child, and robes that required a team of servants just to carry the train. Then, on a bed constructed on top of a ziggurat, essentially a giant pyramid-shaped skyscraper, the two would perform their sacred duty while the crowd below cheered, sang, and probably placed bets on the performance. The logistics alone were mind-boggling. How do you get a bed to the top of a 100-foot-tall pyramid? How do you ensure privacy while also making sure thousands of people can witness the ceremony? How do you explain to visiting dignitaries that yes, this is how we ensure good harvests? The Sumerians had it all figured out, complete with backup priestesses in case the primary one got stage fright and professional musicians to provide appropriate mood music. It was like ancient civilization's first live-streamed reality show, except instead of voting people off the island, they were voting people into divine favor. But the Sumerians weren't content with just public royal consummation. They also practiced something called substitute kings, where if the actual king was predicted to die based on astrological calculations, they would find some poor peasant, crown him king for 100 days, give him all the royal privileges, and then kill him when the dangerous period was over. The real king would hide out as a gardener until the coast was clear. Imagine being so committed to astrology that you're willing to execute innocent people to avoid a bad horoscope. It's like taking your daily zodiac reading and turning it into a death sentence for someone else. These substitute kings lived like royalty for their brief reign. They wore the crown jewels, lived in the palace, ate the finest foods, and had servants attend to their every need. Some historians suggest they were even given access to the royal harem. For 3 months, they were literally living the dream, all while knowing that their expiration date was marked on the calendar in blood. Talk about a deadline you can't miss. The psychological torture of this arrangement was probably worse than immediate execution. It was like winning the lottery and finding out the prize money is paid in poison. The practice gets even darker when you consider that these substitute kings often had families, wives and children who had to watch their loved one rise to unimaginable heights, knowing that his elevation was actually a death sentence. The real king would sometimes provide for the substitute's family after the execution, which was either a gesture of gratitude or the ultimate guilt payment. Either way, it created a bizarre economy where poverty could literally be a death sentence. But at least you'd die wearing really expensive jewelry. Moving westward, we encounter the ancient Greeks, who gave us democracy, philosophy, and theater, and also some of the most psychologically twisted religious practices in human history. The Greeks worshipped gods, who were essentially immortal soap opera characters with unlimited power and serious personality disorders. To honor these divine drama queens, the Greeks developed rituals that combined high art with psychological warfare. Take the Dionysiac mysteries, religious ceremonies devoted to Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and losing your mind in the most spectacular way possible. These weren't your typical church services. Participants, mostly women, would gather in secret locations and engage in rituals that included drinking wine mixed with mysterious substances, handling live snakes, and dancing until they entered states of divine madness. The ceremonies would last for days, with participants gradually losing their grip on reality as believed they were becoming one with the god himself. The psychological manipulation involved was sophisticated beyond belief. The mysteries began with initiation, rituals designed to break down the participants' sense of individual identity. New initiates were blindfolded, spun around until they lost their bearings, and then led through a series of chambers where they experienced orchestrated scenarios designed to induce terror, confusion, and eventually transcendence. They might be confronted with actors dressed as demons, subjected to sudden loud noises, or shown disturbing imagery that would haunt their dreams for months. But the real psychological torture came in the form of the sacred drama, where initiates were forced to watch and eventually participate in theatrical reenactments of mythological stories. These weren't GA-rated bedtime tales. Greek mythology was full of stories involving rape, murder, cannibalism, and familial betrayal. Initiates might be required to play the role of a character being murdered by their own child, or to simulate eating human flesh as part of a cannibalistic feast. The line between acting and reality was deliberately blurred, until participants couldn't tell if they were experiencing a performance or living through an actual divine encounter. The cult of Dionysus also practiced something called spragmos, which involved tearing apart live animals with bare hands and eating the raw flesh. This wasn't just symbolic. Initiates would literally rip apart bulls, goats, and other animals while in a state of religious frenzy. The idea was that by consuming the raw flesh of a sacrifice, they were incorporating the life force of the animal and, by extension, the power of the god. Imagine explaining to your dinner guests that you prefer your meat not just rare, but still struggling. The psychological aftermath of these rituals was profound. Many participants reported life-changing experiences, claiming they had transcended normal human consciousness and achieved direct communication with the divine. Others suffered what we would now recognize as severe trauma, with some never fully recovering from the psychological ordeal. The Greeks didn't have therapists, but they did have a thriving market for amulets and protective charms to ward off the nightmares that often followed mystery cult initiation. Greek society was surprisingly tolerant of these extreme religious practices, viewing them as necessary outlets for emotions and desires that couldn't be expressed in normal civic life. The same people who spent their days debating philosophy and creating beautiful art would spend their nights tearing apart animals and speaking in tongues. It was like having a split personality on a civilizational scale. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but with better architecture and more sophisticated poetry. The Romans, never ones to be outdone in spectacle, took Greek religious practices and cranked them up to 11. Roman religion was essentially a combination of sincere spiritual belief and the greatest show on earth. The Romans believed that their gods were practical entities who could be bargained with, bribed, and occasionally sued for breach of contract. This led to religious ceremonies that resembled business negotiations conducted through interpretive dance and animal sacrifice, Roman haruspicia. The practice of reading divine will through the examination of animal entrails was elevated to an art form that would make modern medical examiners envious. Haruspices, the priests who specialized in organ interpretation, underwent years of training to learn how to read the subtle messages the gods supposedly embedded in liver spots, lung discoloration, and intestinal arrangements. They developed elaborate charts and diagrams mapping every possible variation in organ appearance to specific divine communications. A slightly enlarged spleen might indicate military victory, while unusual liver markings could predict economic prosperity or political upheaval. The precision required was insane. Haruspices had to memorize hundreds of different organ configurations and their corresponding meanings. They used bronze models of livers as study guides, complete with detailed inscriptions indicating which bumps meant good news and which grooves spelled doom. It was like having a medical degree specifically focused on divine communication through cow parts. The Romans took this so seriously that major political and military decisions were postponed until the entrails gave favorable readings. Imagine if modern world leaders consulted chicken livers before declaring war or signing treaties. But the Romans weren't content with just reading entrails. They also practiced augury, the interpretation of bird behavior as divine communication. Augurs, the priests responsible for bird watching, would observe everything from flight patterns to feeding habits to determine the will of the gods. A flock of birds flying left meant one thing, while birds flying right meant something completely different. The speed of their flight, the altitude they maintained, the sounds they made, and even the timing of their calls were all considered significant divine messages. The Romans built entire governmental procedures around bird behavior. Before any major public decision, augurs would set up observation posts and spend hours watching the sky for divine signs. They developed a complex vocabulary to describe different types of bird behavior and their meanings. A single crow flying in a circle might cancel a planned military campaign, while a group of eagles flying in formation could authorize the construction of a new temple. The Roman Empire, one of the most powerful civilizations in human history, was partially governed by bird-watching. The psychological pressure on Roman augurs was enormous. If they misread the signs and a military campaign failed or a political decision backfired, they could be held personally responsible for the disaster. Some augurs developed elaborate systems of double-checking their interpretations, consulting with colleagues, and even keeping detailed records of bird behavior patterns to identify trends and improve their accuracy. It was like being a meteorologist, except instead of predicting weather, you were predicting the fate of nations based on whether a sparrow turned left or right. Roman funeral practices were equally elaborate and psychologically complex. The Romans believed that the dead could influence the living, so they developed rituals designed to keep deceased family members happy and cooperative. Roman families would hold regular banquets in cemeteries, setting places at the table for dead relatives and offering them food and wine. These weren't quick symbolic gestures. Families would spend entire days at gravesites, talking to the dead, updating them on family news, and asking for their continued protection and guidance. The conversations were detailed and personal. Living family members would discuss their problems, seek advice, and even complain about other relatives to their deceased ancestors. Children would be taught to address their dead grandparents as if they were sitting right next to them. The psychological impact of growing up with the constant presence of dead family members shaped Roman attitudes toward death, family obligation, and personal responsibility in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. Romans also practiced a ritual called devotio, where military commanders would literally curse themselves to death to ensure victory in battle. A general facing defeat would perform a specific ceremony, dedicating his own life and the lives of his enemies to the gods of the underworld, then charge into battle seeking death. The belief was that his willing sacrifice would guarantee divine favor for his army. It was the ultimate all-in, bet your life for military victory, with no possibility of a refund. But let's journey across the Atlantic to explore civilizations that made Roman sacrifice look like a casual hobby. The Maya and Aztec empires developed religious practices that were so intensely focused on blood and death that they created entire economies based on human sacrifice. These weren't primitive societies, they were sophisticated civilizations with advanced mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. They built cities that rivaled anything in Europe and developed writing systems more complex than Egyptian hieroglyphs. They also happened to believe that the universe would literally cease to exist if they didn't feed it a steady diet of human hearts. Mayan ball games weren't recreational sports. They were religious ceremonies where the stakes were literally life and death. The game, called pits, was played on elaborate stone courts with balls made of solid rubber that weighed up to 9 pounds. Players couldn't use their hands or feet, only their hips, shoulders, and elbows to keep the ball in motion. The rules were complex, the gameplay was brutal, and the losing team was often sacrificed to the gods. Imagine if the Super Bowl ended with the losing team being executed on the 50-yard line while the crowd cheered. The psychological pressure on ball game players was unimaginable. They weren't just playing for glory or prize money, they were playing for the right to continue breathing. The Maya developed elaborate training regimens for players, combining physical conditioning with spiritual preparation for potential death. Some players spent years preparing for a single game, knowing that one bad play could result in their heart being carved out on an altar while their family watched from the stands. The Maya also practiced a ritual called bloodletting, where nobles would pierce their tongues, earlobes, and genitals with thorns and obsidian blades, then collect their blood on bark paper, which was burned as an offering to the gods. This wasn't a one-time initiation, it was a regular practice that nobles performed throughout their lives. Mayan artwork depicts royal families engaged in bloodletting ceremonies, with intricate details showing the specific techniques used and the spiritual significance of different types of wounds. The psychological aspects of voluntary bloodletting were complex. Nobles who regularly practiced a ritual reported experiencing visions and spiritual communications during the blood loss. Modern medical knowledge suggests they were probably experiencing hallucinations caused by blood loss and pain, but the Maya interpreted these altered states as direct divine contact. Some nobles became addicted to the spiritual highs achieved through bloodletting, requiring increasingly severe wounds to achieve the same transcendent experiences. Mayan women participated in bloodletting rituals by drawing thorned ropes through their tongues, a practice that was considered both spiritually purifying and sexually arousing. The connection between pain, blood, and sexual pleasure in Mayan culture was explicit and celebrated in their art and literature. They developed elaborate ceremonies combining bloodletting with sexual rituals, creating religious practices that were simultaneously sacred and deeply disturbing by modern standards. The Aztecs took human sacrifice to industrial levels that would make modern assembly lines look inefficient. During the dedication of the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs sacrificed an estimated 84,000 people over 4 days. The logistics alone was staggering: organizing, transporting, and sacrificing over 20,000 people per day required military-level planning and execution. They developed specialized roles for different aspects of the sacrifice process. Some priests were responsible for restraining victims, others for performing the actual heart removal, and still others for disposing of the bodies. The Aztec method of heart extraction was refined to an art form. The victim would be stretched over a curved stone altar, held down by 4 priests, while a 5th used an obsidian knife to make a precise incision below the ribs. The priest would then reach into the chest cavity and remove the still beating heart, which was offered to the gods while the body was thrown down the temple steps. The entire process took less than a minute when performed by experienced priests. They were like cardiac surgeons, except their goal was removal rather than repair, and their patient survival rate was exactly 0. The Aztecs categorized different types of sacrifice for different gods and occasions. Warriors captured in battle were often sacrificed to the war god Huitzilopochtli, while children were drowned as offerings to the rain god Tlaloc. The method and timing of sacrifice were considered crucial. A warrior had to be sacrificed while the sun was at its highest point, while children were drowned during the dry season to encourage rainfall. The Aztecs developed elaborate calendars coordinating different types of sacrifices with astronomical events, seasonal changes, and religious festivals. The psychological impact on Aztec society was profound. Children grew up knowing that their primary value to society might be as potential sacrificial offerings. Parents would sometimes volunteer their children for sacrifice during times of crisis, believing that their child's death would save the community from disaster. The social pressure to participate in or support human sacrifice was enormous. Refusing to provide victims or expressing doubt about the practice could result in being selected for sacrifice yourself. Aztec priests underwent years of training, not just in religious doctrine, but in the practical skills of efficient human sacrifice. They learned anatomy, developed techniques for rapid heart removal, and practiced on animal cadavers before being allowed to sacrifice humans. The priests were essentially professional executioners with theological degrees. They lived in temple complexes, followed strict dietary rules, and spent their days either performing sacrifices or preparing for the next round of religious killing. The Aztecs also practiced a ritual called flaying, where they would skin sacrificial victims and wear their hides as clothing during religious ceremonies. The festival of Zait-Totec, the flayed lord, involved priests wearing the complete skin of sacrificed humans for 20 days, during which time the skin would gradually decay and rot. The smell alone must have been unbearable, but the psychological impact of wearing another person's skin while conducting religious ceremonies adds layers of horror that modern minds can barely process. But let's shift our focus to ancient India, where the concept of extreme religious dedication took forms that were both more subtle and more psychologically complex than the blood-soaked altars of Mesoamerica. Ancient Indian religious practices included rituals that challenged the boundaries between self-destruction and spiritual transcendence in ways that continue to puzzle historians and psychologists today. The practice of sati, where widows would throw themselves onto their husband's funeral pyre, represented one of the most psychologically complex rituals in human history. This wasn't simply suicide. It was a religious ceremony that transformed a woman's death into a spiritual achievement that supposedly benefited her entire family and community. The widow would spend days preparing for the ritual, fasting, praying, and receiving visits from family members who would either encourage her decision or attempt to dissuade her, depending on their personal beliefs and the political implications of her choice. The psychological manipulation involved in sati was sophisticated and widows were often told that their husband's death was caused by their own spiritual failings, and that only through self-sacrifice could they atone for their inadequacies and ensure their husband's successful journey to the afterlife. They were also informed that failure to perform sati would result in their family losing social status and economic support. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. It was a carefully orchestrated social pressure campaign designed to make death seem like the only honorable option. The actual ceremony involved elaborate preparations that increased the psychological pressure on the widow. She would be dressed in her finest wedding clothes, adorned with jewelry and flowers, and paraded through the community while people praised her courage and devotion. The funeral pyre would be constructed with specific materials and arranged according to religious protocols. The widow would walk around the pyre multiple times, often with her husband's body already burning, before climbing onto the flames. The combination of social pressure, religious conviction, and sheer terror must have created a psychological state that modern trauma specialists can barely imagine. Ancient India also developed the practice of tapas, extreme ascetic practices, designed to generate spiritual power through self-imposed suffering. Some ascetics would stand on one leg for years, allowing the unused leg to wither and become useless. Others would stare directly into the sun until they went blind, believing that the physical blindness would enhance their spiritual vision. Some would hold one or both arms above their heads until the muscles atrophied and the limbs became permanently fixed in position. The psychological dedication required for these practices was extraordinary. Ascetics would spend decades engaged in behaviors that were essentially sophisticated forms of self-torture, maintaining their commitment through religious conviction and social support from communities that viewed their suffering as spiritually beneficial. The line between religious devotion and mental illness was often unclear, but ancient Indian society generally interpreted extreme ascetic behavior as evidence of spiritual advancement rather than psychological disturbance. Some ascetics practiced urdhva, keeping their arms raised above their heads for so long that the arms would become permanently frozen in position. Others would practice silence for decades, never speaking a word while continuing to interact with society through gestures and written communication. The most extreme practitioners would engage in breatharian practices, claiming to survive without food or water for extended periods through pure spiritual energy. While most of these extreme claims were probably exaggerated, the psychological commitment required to maintain such practices for years or decades was undeniably real. Ancient Indian religious practices also included elaborate death rituals designed to ensure proper reincarnation. The Garuda Purana describes detailed procedures for preparing the dying person's consciousness for the transition to the next life. Family members would surround the dying person, chanting specific prayers and mantras while performing rituals designed to guide the departing soul toward favorable rebirth. The dying person was expected to maintain conscious awareness throughout the death process, making specific spiritual choices that would determine their next incarnation. The psychological complexity of conscious dying was immense. The dying person had to balance physical pain and weakness with intense spiritual focus, making crucial decisions about their spiritual future while their body was shutting down. Family members had to provide emotional support while also ensuring that the proper religious protocols were followed exactly. Knowing that any mistakes could doom their loved one to thousands of years of unfavorable rebirths, ancient China developed its own unique approaches to extreme religious practice, often focusing on achieving immortality through increasingly desperate and dangerous methods. Taoist alchemists spent centuries trying to create elixirs of immortality, experimenting with combinations of mercury, lead arsenic, and other toxic substances that probably shortened their lives rather than extending them. The irony was lost on practitioners who continued to consume poisonous concoctions while claiming to be on the verge of achieving eternal life. Chinese emperors became obsessed with immortality to degrees that bordered on insanity. Emperor Qin Shi Huang sent expeditions to find mythical islands where immortals supposedly lived, spending enormous amounts of the empire's resources on what were essentially elaborate wild goose chases. He consumed various alchemical preparations that probably contributed to his death at age 49, making him a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing immortality through chemistry. The practice of feng shui in ancient China involved elaborate rituals designed to harmonize human activities with cosmic forces. While modern feng shui is often viewed as a form of interior decoration, ancient Chinese feng shui practitioners would spend months or years analyzing the energy patterns of specific locations before determining whether they were suitable for buildings, graves, or other human activities. The complexity of these analyses was extraordinary, involving mathematical calculations, astronomical observations, and geographic surveys that rivals modern environmental impact studies. Chinese funeral practices included the tradition of ghost marriages, where deceased individuals would be married to other dead people to ensure they wouldn't be lonely in the afterlife. Families would arrange marriages between their deceased relatives, complete with wedding ceremonies conducted with the corpses of both bride and groom. These marriages were considered legally and spiritually binding, creating family relationships that extended beyond death. The psychological impact on surviving family members, who had to navigate complex kinship relationships with dead people, added layers of emotional complexity to the normal grieving process. Ancient Chinese culture also developed the practice of foot binding, a ritual transformation of women's feet that was both culturally significant and physically devastating. The process began when girls were between 4 and 6 years old, involving the breaking of foot bones and the tight binding of feet to prevent normal growth. The result was feet that were considered sexually attractive and socially prestigious, but which made normal walking difficult or impossible. The psychological impact on women who underwent foot binding was complex. They experienced both enhanced social status and severe physical limitation, creating a bizarre form of empowerment. Through disability, the foot binding process was extraordinarily painful and required years of gradual bone breaking and reshaping. Mothers would typically perform the procedure on their daughters, creating psychological trauma around the mother-daughter relationship that persisted throughout the woman's life. The practice was justified through cultural beliefs about female beauty and social status, but the physical and psychological costs were enormous. Women with bound feet were essentially disabled by their own culture's beauty standards, creating a form of ritualized self-harm that was passed down through generations. Let's venture into the practices of indigenous African cultures, where ritual scarification transformed the human body into a living canvas of spiritual and social information. The process wasn't simply decorative, it was a form of permanent documentation that recorded an individual's clan affiliation, social status, spiritual achievements, and personal history in patterns carved directly into their flesh. The scarification process was intensely painful and required weeks or months of healing, during which time the individual would be isolated from the community and subjected to intensive spiritual instruction. The psychological significance of scarification went far beyond the physical transformation. The process represented a death and rebirth, with the individual's old identity being literally carved away and replaced with a new spiritual and social persona. The pain was considered essential to the transformation. Without suffering, the spiritual change couldn't occur. Communities developed elaborate support systems for individuals undergoing scarification, combining medical care with spiritual guidance and social celebration. Some African cultures practiced ritualized combat as part of coming-of-age ceremonies, where young men would fight with spears, clubs, or other weapons until blood was drawn. The combat wasn't intended to cause serious injury, but the psychological impact was significant. Young men had to prove their courage in fighting ability in front of their entire community, knowing that failure could result in social rejection and reduced marriage prospects. The combination of physical danger, social pressure, and ritual significance created intense psychological experiences that marked the transition from childhood to adulthood. African cultures also developed complex funeral practices that could last for months or years after an individual's death. Some communities would keep the deceased's body in their home for weeks while conducting elaborate ceremonies designed to ensure the person's successful transition to the spirit world. Family members would continue to interact with the body as if the person was still alive, providing food, changing clothes, and conducting normal conversations. The psychological impact of living with a decomposing corpse while pretending they were still alive must have been enormous. But the practice was considered essential for maintaining proper relationships with the dead. The practice of spirit possession in various African cultures involved individuals allowing spirits of deceased ancestors or supernatural entities to take control of their bodies during religious ceremonies. The psychological transformation was dramatic. Possessed individuals would speak in different voices, demonstrate knowledge they didn't normally possess, and perform physical feats that seemed impossible given their normal abilities. The community would interact with the possessed person as if they were actually speaking with the spirit, creating complex psychological dynamics that blurred the line between individual identity and spiritual communication. Pacific Island cultures developed their own unique approaches to extreme ritual practice, often involving elaborate ceremonies that combined physical transformation with spiritual transcendence. The practice of Te Taito in Polynesian cultures involved extensive tattooing that covered large portions of the body with intricate designs that documented the individual's family history, spiritual achievements, and social status. The tattooing process could take months or years to complete and was extraordinarily painful, requiring the individual to endure hours of needlework while maintaining composure and spiritual focus. The psychological significance of Polynesian tattooing was immense. The designs weren't just decorative, they were a form of spiritual armor that protected the individual from supernatural dangers and enhanced their spiritual power. The pain of the tattooing process was considered essential to the spiritual transformation, with individuals who couldn't endure the pain being considered spiritually weak and socially inferior. The tattoos also served as a form of permanent identification that couldn't be removed or falsified, creating a system of social documentation that was literally embedded in people's skin. Pacific Island cultures also practiced elaborate initiation ceremonies that could last for months and involved complete social isolation, dietary restrictions, and intensive spiritual instruction. Initiates would be taken from their families and communities, often in the middle of the night, and transported to remote locations where they would undergo physical and psychological ordeals designed to transform them from children into adults. The isolation was complete. Initiates couldn't communicate with their families or previous social contacts, and any violation of the isolation rules could result in severe punishment or even death. The psychological impact of these initiation ceremonies was profound and permanent. Initiates would return to their communities as completely different people, with new names, new social roles, and new spiritual responsibilities. The ceremonies created intense bonds between initiates who went through the experience together, forming social networks that would last throughout their lives. The combination of physical hardship, social isolation, and spiritual instruction created psychological changes that were considered essential for proper adult functioning in the community. Some Pacific Island cultures practiced ritual cannibalism as part of religious ceremonies, believing that consuming the flesh of enemies or deceased relatives would transfer their spiritual power to the consumer. The practice wasn't simply about nutrition. It was a complex spiritual technology designed to manipulate supernatural forces and enhance the consumer's personal power. The psychological impact of cannibalism on both the consumers and the community was enormous, creating social bonds and spiritual relationships that were literally embodied through the act of consumption. The preparation and consumption of human flesh involved elaborate rituals that could last for days. Specific body parts were assigned to different social roles. Warriors might consume the heart and liver to gain courage and strength, while spiritual leaders might consume the brain to gain wisdom and supernatural knowledge. The entire community would participate in the ceremonies, creating shared psychological experiences that bound them together through the most intimate possible form of consumption. As we near the end of our journey through the bizarre rituals of ancient civilizations, it's worth reflecting on what these practices tell us about human nature and the lengths people will go to make sense of their world. These weren't the actions of primitive or unintelligent people. They were sophisticated responses to the fundamental questions that still plague humanity today. Why do we exist? What happens when we die? How can we influence forces beyond our control? How do we create meaning in a chaotic universe? The rituals we've explored represent humanity's most creative and desperate attempts to answer these questions through direct action. When faced with the uncertainty of existence, our ancestors didn't just philosophize, they experimented. They tried everything from human sacrifice to divine marriage to ritual cannibalism, searching for techniques that would give them some measure of control over their fate. The fact that many of these practices seem bizarre or horrific to modern sensibilities doesn't diminish their significance as human responses to existential uncertainty. What's perhaps most striking about these ancient rituals is how they reveal the consistency of human psychological needs across cultures and time periods. Whether we're talking about Egyptian mummification, Aztec heart sacrifice, or Pacific Island initiation ceremonies, the underlying motivations are remarkably similar. The desire to transcend ordinary human limitations, to communicate with supernatural forces, to create meaning through suffering, and to bind communities together. Through shared intense experiences, the psychological sophistication of these practices is also noteworthy. Ancient cultures developed elaborate techniques for inducing altered states of consciousness, creating social pressure for participation in extreme rituals, and managing the psychological aftermath of traumatic religious experiences. They understood that spiritual transformation required more than just belief. It required intense physical and emotional experiences that would fundamentally alter an individual's relationship with themselves and their community. Modern people often look at these ancient rituals with a mixture of fascination and horror, viewing them as evidence of humanity's primitive past that we've fortunately evolved beyond. But this perspective might be overly simplistic. While we've certainly abandoned the more extreme practices like human sacrifice and ritual cannibalism, we've also lost some of the psychological and social benefits that these practices provided. Ancient rituals created intense community bonds, provided clear pathways for spiritual development, and offered individuals meaningful roles in cosmic processes larger than themselves. Contemporary society still struggles with many of the same existential questions that motivated ancient ritual practices, but our responses tend to be more individualistic and less communally binding. We seek transcendence through therapy, extreme sports, recreational drugs, and spiritual retreats, but these modern approaches often lack the deep community integration and clear social meaning that characterized ancient rituals. The decline of extreme ritual practices in modern society has coincided with increases in anxiety, depression, and social isolation problems that were relatively rare in ancient communities where individuals had clearly defined roles in cosmic processes and intense shared experiences that bound them to their neighbors. This isn't to suggest that we should return to human sacrifice and ritual cannibalism, but rather to recognize that these practices fulfill genuine human needs that we're still struggling to address through less extreme means. The study of ancient rituals also reveals the remarkable adaptability and creativity of human consciousness. Faced with the need to create meaning and social cohesion, our ancestors developed practices that pushed the boundaries of human experience in ways that seem almost impossible from our modern perspective. They created technologies of consciousness that could reliably produce profound spiritual experiences, alter social relationships, and transform individual identity through carefully orchestrated combinations of physical ordeal, social pressure, and spiritual instruction. Perhaps most importantly, these ancient rituals demonstrate that the human capacity for both creativity and cruelty is virtually unlimited. When motivated by genuine spiritual conviction, the same impulses that led to the construction of magnificent temples and the development of sophisticated spiritual philosophies also drove people to tear out beating hearts and throw babies into fires. This paradox reveals something fundamental about human nature. We are capable of both transcendent beauty and horrific violence, often simultaneously and in service of the same goals. The psychological legacy of these ancient practices continues to influence modern behavior in ways we rarely recognize. Our fascination with horror movies, extreme sports, body modification, and intense spiritual experiences reflects the same underlying drives that motivated ancient ritual practices. The difference is that modern expressions of these drives are typically individualistic and commercial rather than communal and religious. We seek the psychological benefits of extreme experience without the social costs and community responsibilities that characterized ancient rituals. The transformation of human consciousness through ordeal and ceremony was once a central organizing principle of human society. Every individual was expected to undergo transformative experiences that would fundamentally alter their relationship with themselves, their community, and the cosmos. These experiences created social bonds that lasted lifetimes and provided individuals with clear roles in meaningful cosmic processes. The abandonment of these practices has left a psychological and social vacuum that we're still learning how to fill. Modern attempts to recreate the psychological benefits of ancient rituals often fall short because they lack the genuine stakes and community integration that made the original practices so powerful. Contemporary vision quests, sweat lodges, and spiritual retreats provide valuable experiences, but they operate within a cultural context that values individual choice and personal safety over communal transformation and cosmic responsibility. The result is experiences that are psychologically beneficial but lack the life-filtering intensity that characterized ancient initiation ceremonies. The medical and psychological understanding of ancient ritual practices reveals their sophisticated approach to consciousness alteration and trauma processing. Many of these practices involve techniques that modern neuroscience recognizes as effective methods for inducing altered states of consciousness, processing traumatic experiences, and creating lasting behavioral changes. Ancient cultures developed these techniques through centuries of experimentation and refinement, creating technologies of human transformation that were remarkably effective despite their apparent brutality. The social functions of extreme ritual practices were equally sophisticated. These ceremonies provided mechanisms for resolving conflicts, redistributing resources, reinforcing social hierarchies, and creating shared meaning that bound communities together across generations. They served as insurance policies against social fragmentation, providing intense shared experiences that created bonds stronger than family relationships and more lasting than political alliances. The decline of these practices has left modern societies struggling with problems of social cohesion, individual purpose, and collective meaning that ancient communities addressed through ritual technology. We've gained tremendously in terms of individual freedom, personal safety, and rational understanding. But we've also lost some of the psychological and social benefits that extreme ritual practices provided. The challenge for modern society is to find ways to fulfill these genuine human needs without returning to the destructive aspects of ancient practices. The study of ancient rituals also reveals the importance of physical experience in spiritual and psychological transformation. Modern approaches to personal development often emphasize intellectual understanding and emotional processing. But ancient practices recognized that profound change requires intense physical experience that engages the entire person. The body remembers transformative experiences in ways that the mind alone cannot, creating lasting changes that affect behavior, relationships, and worldview for decades after the original experience. The role of pain and ordeal in ancient spiritual practices reflects a sophisticated understanding of consciousness and identity that modern psychology is only beginning to appreciate. Physical suffering, when voluntarily undertaken in a meaningful context, can produce profound psychological changes that are difficult to achieve through other means. The combination of physical challenge, social support, and spiritual meaning created a powerful technology for personal transformation that modern society has largely abandoned in favor of safer but less effective approaches. As we conclude our exploration of these bizarre ancient rituals, we're left with a complex legacy that challenges our assumptions about human nature, spiritual development, and social organization. These practices reveal the extraordinary lengths that humans will go to create meaning, community, and transcendence, even when the costs are enormous. They demonstrate both the nobility and the horror of human spiritual aspiration, showing us capabilities we didn't know we possessed and depths we hope we'll never explore again. The ancient world was a place where the boundaries between the sacred and the savage, the spiritual and the psychological, the individual and the community, were drawn very differently than they are today. People lived in closer proximity to death, pain, and uncertainty, and they developed ritual technologies designed to help them navigate these harsh realities with dignity, meaning, and mutual support. The fact that these technologies often involved practices that seem abhorrent to modern sensibilities doesn't diminish their effectiveness or their importance in understanding human potential. Perhaps the most important lesson from our journey through ancient ritual practices is that human beings are far more adaptable, creative, and resilient than we typically imagine. Our ancestors faced challenges that would break most modern people, yet they not only survived but created magnificent civilizations that continue to inspire us thousands of years later. They did this not despite their extreme ritual practices, but partly because of them. These ceremonies provided the psychological and social resources necessary to build and maintain complex societies under conditions of extraordinary hardship and uncertainty. The bizarre rituals of ancient civilizations remind us that human consciousness is capable of achievements and experiences that stretch the boundaries of what we consider possible. They challenge us to expand our understanding of human potential while also serving as cautionary tales about the dangers of taking spiritual conviction to extremes. They reveal both the heights and depths of human experience, showing us possibilities we might never have imagined and warning us about paths we should never again explore. In the end, these ancient practices serve as a mirror reflecting our own psychological needs, spiritual aspirations, and social challenges. They show us where we've come from, what we've lost, and what we might yet become. They remind us that the human journey toward meaning, transcendence, and community is far from over, and that the questions our ancestors tried to answer through ritual and sacrifice are the same questions we're still asking today. The methods may have changed, but the fundamental human need to create meaning through shared experience, to transcend ordinary limitations through extraordinary effort, and to bind communities together through powerful ceremonies remains as strong as ever. The legacy of these ancient rituals lives on in our continued fascination with transformation, our ongoing search for meaning, and our persistent need for community experiences that connect us to something larger than ourselves. While we may never again see the extreme practices of our ancestors, we continue to seek the psychological and spiritual benefits they provided through new forms of ceremony, challenge, and shared meaning. The human drive toward transcendence through ordeal, community through shared intensity, and meaning through sacrifice continues to shape our world in ways both obvious and subtle, ensuring that the bizarre rituals of ancient civilizations remain relevant to our modern struggles with existence, purpose, and connection. So, the next time you find yourself complaining about a difficult workout, a challenging meditation retreat, or an intense team-building exercise, remember that you're participating in a tradition that stretches back to the very beginning of human civilization. The forms may have evolved, but the underlying human need to transform consciousness through shared ordeal remains unchanged. We are still, in our own sanitized way, the spiritual descendants of people who threw babies into fires and danced with mummies, seeking transcendence through whatever means our cultures consider acceptable. The only difference is that our ancestors were honest about the intensity required for real transformation, while we prefer to pretend that profound change can be achieved through comfortable, convenient, and socially acceptable methods. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson from these ancient practices. Real transformation has always required real commitment, real sacrifice, and real courage. The specific forms of that commitment may change with the times, but the fundamental requirements remain constant. Whether we're talking about Egyptian mummification, Aztec heart sacrifice, or modern vision quests, the price of transcendence has always been the willingness to surrender something valuable in service of something greater. Our ancestors understood this truth and built their entire civilizations around it. The question for us is whether we still have the courage to pay that price, or whether we'll continue to seek transformation through increasingly diluted substitutes that promise the rewards without demanding the sacrifice. The bizarre rituals of ancient civilizations stand as monuments to human, spiritual ambition and cautionary tales about the dangers of religious extremism. They remind us that the capacity for both transcendence and horror lies within every human heart, and that the difference between sacred ceremony and savage brutality often depends on nothing more than cultural context and historical perspective. They challenge us to honor our spiritual heritage while learning from our ancestors' mistakes, to seek transcendence without losing our humanity, and to build communities without sacrificing individuals on the altar of collective need. In the end, these ancient practices reveal the eternal human struggle to create meaning in a meaningless universe, to find purpose in apparent chaos, and to connect with something greater than ourselves through whatever means our courage and creativity can devise. The methods may seem bizarre, but the motivation is eternal and universal. We are all, in our own way, still dancing around the same fires our ancestors lit, still seeking the same transcendence they pursued, still trying to answer the same questions that drove them to such extraordinary lengths. The only difference is that we've learned to be more careful about how we go about it.